The first episode of Goblin Slayer very quickly established its reputation as a dark fantasy anime some describe as gritty and others describe as vile. But the fact remains, this is what Goblin Slayer came to be known for almost immediately. It is understandable then that some viewers may find themselves confused at some of the more overt moments of levity in an otherwise harsh and brutal universe. How can the show go from its infamous tone of horrible depictions of violence to one of friendly banter on a dime like that? And isn't it bad for a story to be so inconsistent? Normally, when a narrative changes its overall tone, it coincides with something significant happening, causing permanent consequences for the characters involved. As a result, it's not unusual for a tone to fluctuate as a story progresses. In adventure stories, there's a sense of elation and excitement when the hero leaves their home to start their quest, and later, tragedy can strike, which is marked by a more somber and serious tone, only for the hero to come out the other end stronger for the experience. Pretty standard stuff. What makes Goblin Slayer different is that its tonal shifts don't necessitate a major event in the narrative. Both the atrocity and the amicability are regular components of the story and take place about as often as each other. This means that it's not uncommon for moments of bloodshed to be followed by banter between characters without much transition between them, and vice versa. While this can make the narrative feel disjointed and somewhat confusing, the constant shifting of tones bolsters one of the major underlying themes of Goblin Slayer. And that is, at its core, Goblin Slayer is fundamentally a story about a man seeking redemption. And the way for the man beneath the helmet to achieve that redemption is laid out in two equally represented pathways with their accompanying tones: revenge and absolution. The story begins with Goblin Slayer deeply entrenched in seeking redemption through his revenge, as he has done for years, and as a result the ensuing brutality by the goblins and the titular protagonist himself serve to establish the unflinchingly dark tone that the show has ultimately become known for. Like it or not, the first appearance of Goblin Slayer and all the barbarism leading up to it immediately inculcates the viewer with an empathy for his plight. And as a result, they are given no reason to challenge the justification he gives for his crusade as it goes on. After all, what happens in the first episode is explanation enough for his hatred of goblins, never mind the personal stake he has in their extinction. This half of the show's tone is characterized by acts that are difficult to watch, anything from how the goblins treat their victims to how Goblin Slayer responds in kind. And make no mistake, that's precisely the point. Goblin Slayer represents revenge incarnate. With the introduction of Priestess, though, comes the concept of absolution. It is by no means a coincidence that Goblin Slayer's new companion is a member of the clergy. If Goblin Slayer himself is the denizen of the darkest parts of the human experience, Priestess resides in his lightest parts, arguably to a fault. Her compassion is evident in moments such as her objection to the murder of the goblin children, and through her relationship with Goblin Slayer, she offers him the ability to find redemption by reintegrating back into a society he had well and truly forsaken, little by little. When Priestess protests to some of Goblin Slayer's more cruel tactics, this causes him to substitute them for less cruel ones, and reflect on the necessity of that cruelty. She is also instrumental in helping Goblin Slayer find true allies in his travelling partners, in stark contrast to his history of utilitarian arrangements and outright hostile interactions within the guild, which results in him learning to be able to crack jokes and genuinely rely on his teammates. Through travelling with Priestess, and being presented with her moral example, Goblin Slayer is presented with the ever-increasing possibility of finding redemption through forgiving himself, and not living a life full of bloodshed and rage, but one of compassion and genuine connections to the people around him. As a result, Priestess represents the very concept of absolution for Goblin Slayer by trying to keep him in check. In principle, it should be an enormous problem for the show to present these contrasting tones in the ratio and frequency that it does. After all, it makes total sense that the narrative would be difficult to take seriously in its darker parts if we know that a joke about cheese or drenching yourself in goblin blood isn't too far behind. It's a delicate balance to be sure, but it's one I think Goblin Slayer manages to finesse. Because when push comes to shove, the trail of corpses Goblin Slayer leaves in his wake is just as significant to the narrative as his ability to connect with people, when the show isn't just about goblin slaying, but the man doing the slaying too. The purpose of this contrast, and why it's not only not a bad thing but in fact a good one, is to demonstrate the struggles both internal and external that Goblin Slayer is experiencing in real time. The balancing of the physical battles he has to fight, and the ones within his own psyche, help to flesh out an otherwise one-dimensional killing machine character propped up by nothing more than power fantasy. And that would be perfectly fine in its own right, but moments such as Goblin Slayer supposing that goblins come from the moon, and that he believes envy to be their driving force, elaborates on his already legitimate reasons for slaying the goblins in the first place. Despite the fact that Goblin Slayer is adept at murdering goblins in every conceivable way, he is also faced with something as mundane as being chastised for his poor communication skills, or frankly, learning to care about something other than killing goblins. But why is this arc even worth including in the story? In becoming the silver-ranked hero we all know him as, the man beneath the helmet lost something of his own humanity. To the goblins, he himself is a goblin, and his journey towards regaining it runs concurrently with his quest for revenge, ultimately increasing the stake in both. The interpersonal drama, if it can so be called, may seem boring in principle. After all, you could argue that in a series called Goblin Slayer, anything that isn't slaying goblins is. But there is real emotional payoff whenever Goblin Slayer makes progress with his teammates, and even comedic payoff when he tries to make a joke. And honestly, I don't think either of these detract from any of the romps through the world's darker side. Far from it. Fundamentally, the changes that our eponymous hero undergoes personally are just as crucial to the story being told as all the goblin slaying. And this sentiment is echoed even by the way the show itself is constructed. The opening song's calm and contemplative tone clashes heavily with the lyrics about reclaiming what rightfully belongs to you and shirking the whims of fate. And its somber melody clashes even further with Goblin Slayer's first appearance. You know, the one accentuated by roaring electric guitars and rampant bloodshed. Furthermore, monologues about justifying violence and brutality are always narrated by Goblin Slayer's voice, whereas ones about the nature of the world and being an adventurer within it are all from Priestess. Each philosophy is represented in the show by their respective champion, and as a result the viewer is always mindful of how they compete and contrast with one another. In the battles, Goblin Slayer is teaching Priestess, and in society, Priestess is teaching Goblin Slayer. The flippant way that Goblin Slayer goes from the extreme to the mundane is no doubt cause for confusion or derision for a lot of people trying to get into it, and that's a fair reaction to such an unusual way to represent a narrative. But it seems clear to me that the story's refusal to linger too long on one emotional note helps elucidate the erratic way our hero's tale continues to unfold, be that on the battlefield or by the campfire. But more importantly, the two disparate but equally important tones help to bring significance to elements of Goblin Slayer's characterization that the narrative could easily have truncated or foregone entirely and still remain totally serviceable. If all the action and gore wasn't enough to entertain you, or the graphic content was enough to repel you, maybe the eternal struggle between revenge and absolution for a man who has lost everything is exactly the perspective you need on this show. That's all from me for now on Goblin Slayer. For more fantasy stylings, check out my video on how the Mother's Rosario arc returned Sword Art Online to its former glory. And for more of my thoughts on how a show is constructed, I've got a video about a neat trick used in the dub for Steins Gate Zero. Otherwise, you can subscribe here for even more, or follow me on Twitter for less formal and more frequent thoughts.